20 years ago, my parents threw me out into a freezing December blizzard because my teenage pregnancy threatened their country club image. Tonight, they crashed my multi-million-dollar charity gala, desperately demanding to meet the very grandson they once called a disgrace. But what they found out next completely destroyed their reality. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. The chandeliers of the Atlanta Ritz-Carlton cast a golden glow over the crowded ballroom. I stood at the podium ready to deliver the keynote address for my venture capital firm's annual gala. Hundreds of Atlanta's most influential figures sat before me, quietly raising their champagne glasses in a toast. My name is Zara Washington. I am 35 years old, and I built my business empire from absolutely nothing. Just as I opened my mouth to speak, the heavy doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open with a deafening crash. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Whispers immediately rippled through the large crowd of wealthy dignitaries and corporate investors. Marching down the center aisle was my mother, Patricia, wearing a lavish fur coat and an expression of absolute unfiltered entitlement. Right beside her was my father, Harold, his face red with manic, desperate energy. Trailing closely behind them was my older sister, Chloe, draped in a designer dress she could definitely no longer afford. Beside Chloe walked her arrogant husband, Bradley Sinclair, an old money heir whose family name commanded respect in all the wrong ways. I had not spoken to my biological family in 2 full decades, yet here they were marching toward me confidently, as if they owned the very ground I stood on. My private security team immediately moved to intercept them, stepping firmly into the aisle to block their path forward. I raised my right hand slightly, signaling my highly trained guards to stand down. I wanted to hear exactly what kind of audacity brought them into my territory tonight. Patricia pushed past a stunned waiter and marched directly onto the elevated stage. Before anyone could react, she aggressively snatched the spare microphone from the metal podium stand. Her voice echoed sharply through the massive ballroom, completely shattering the sophisticated, peaceful atmosphere. "Call your illegitimate son out here right now," she commanded loudly, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "That boy is the eldest grandson of the Washington family, and we know he turned 20 yesterday. He needs to fulfill his duty to this bloodline immediately. Bring him out here so he can sign the transfer documents to save his grandfather's failing company." The sheer delusion of her demand hung heavily in the tense air. The elite guests stared in absolute unblinking shock. I did not yell back. I did not flinch or cower. I simply stepped away from the podium, smoothly adjusting the fabric of my tailored evening gown. I looked my mother directly in the eyes, ensuring my voice carried perfectly through my own lapel microphone so every single person in the room could hear me. "The last time you referred to my son as anything related to this family," I said, my tone deadly calm and perfectly steady, "was when you violently threw a garbage bag of my clothes into the snow." I was 15 years old, absolutely terrified, and freezing to death. "You stood on your perfect front porch and told me that my unborn child would forever stain your precious reputation in the Atlanta high society. You looked at a frightened teenager and told me I was completely dead to you. So why is your memory suddenly functioning so incredibly well tonight?" Patricia's face flushed crimson as the guests began to murmur. She opened her mouth to argue, but Chloe stepped forward, crossing her arms defensively. "You owe us, Zara," Chloe snapped, rolling her eyes. "We gave you life and a name. You are being selfish while our father's business is suffering. You should be begging for our forgiveness." I let out a slow, incredibly quiet laugh that made my sister step back nervously. "You are standing in a luxurious ballroom that I paid for at a major charity event I organized, demanding money from a nephew you have never even met. The level of entitlement you possess is truly genuinely staggering." That was when Bradley decided to intervene in the escalating confrontation. He stepped proudly in front of my sister, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a smug, incredibly condescending smile. He looked at me with the exact same racial and classist superiority he always carried, clearly believing his Sinclair family name made him utterly invincible against a woman like me. "Listen carefully," Zara Bradley sneered maliciously, pulling a thickly folded legal document from his tailored breast pocket and waving it in the air like a victorious weapon. His presence alone brought back memories of how my parents worshipped his family wealth. They thought marrying Chloe to a Sinclair would elevate our status. Instead, it tied them to a man who looked down on us. I remained silent, watching his pathetic display of power. My son Julian is a brilliant student who built his own analytics firm while at Stanford. You are standing in my building, attempting to intimidate me with legal threats that hold absolutely no weight. Your arrogance blinds you to the reality of who holds the power here tonight. My family's elite legal team finally found the loophole we needed. Your great-grandfather's generational trust specifically states the funds must be released to the firstborn male heir upon his 20th birthday. That means the $10 million legally belongs to your son. But as his rightful family, we have the authority to guide those assets today. We have a signed court order right here in my hand. Bradley snapped the document with his manicured fingers, letting the crisp sound echo through the dead silence of the ballroom. He paced across the front of the stage with the leisurely, arrogant stride of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He looked out at the sea of shocked faces, my investors, my peers, my friends, and offered them an apologetic smile. "Forgive my sister-in-law, ladies and gentlemen," Bradley announced, projecting his voice effortlessly. "She has always had a flair for the dramatic. It comes from a lack of proper refinement, I suppose." He turned back to me, his blue eyes glinting with a toxic mixture of pity and absolute superiority. "Let us drop the independent billionaire act, Zara. We all know how hard it is for a single mother to scrape by, especially one who dropped out of high school. It is quite admirable, really, that you managed to hustle your way into this ballroom. But managing a charity gala is vastly different from managing generational wealth, real wealth, Sinclair wealth." Bradley smoothed the lapel of his custom suit. "Yesterday, your illegitimate son Julian turned 20 years old. According to the original Washington Family Trust established by your great-grandfather, the firstborn male heir inherits the primary capital upon his 20th birthday. $10 million, Zara. $10 million that has been sitting in escrow accumulating interest, waiting for a patriarch to claim it." He stepped closer, invading my personal space. "Now, Zara, we both know you lack the financial literacy to guide a boy through managing an 8-figure trust. You have spent your life hustling. $10 million is old money territory. It requires sophisticated management and an understanding of market dynamics that a runaway teen mother simply cannot possess." A collective gasp rippled through the stunned audience. I wanted Bradley to keep talking. I wanted every influential person in Atlanta to witness the exact brand of venom my family had poisoned me with 20 years ago. "You see, Zara, the Washington family business is currently facing temporary liquidity issues." Bradley continued, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Harold needs an immediate capital injection to stabilize the manufacturing division. It is Julian's duty as the heir to transfer that $10 million directly into the corporate holding account. It is the only way to save the family legacy. We just need you to drag the boy out here so he can sign the authorization immediately." I stared directly at him, and what if I say no? Bradley laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made my skin crawl. "You do not have the luxury of saying no. You are a statistical anomaly, Zara. An uneducated single mother playing dress-up in a silk gown. My family has owned politicians and judges in this state for 4 generations. If you do not produce the boy and make him sign these papers tonight, my lawyers will freeze your pathetic little venture capital firm by morning. We will tie you up in so much litigation, you will be begging to clean my pool just to pay your legal fees." Chloe stepped up beside her arrogant husband, her eyes wide with greed. "Just do it, Zara," she demanded loudly. "Stop being so stubborn. You ruined our family reputation when you got pregnant. You owe us this money. It belongs to us now. I looked at my father, Harold, who was sweating profusely under the hot stage lights. He refused to meet my gaze, staring instead at the legal document in Bradley's hand as if it were a winning lottery ticket. He was willing to let his son-in-law publicly humiliate his daughter just to get his hands on my son's money. They had not changed at all. 20 years ago, they threw me out into a blizzard to protect their image, and tonight, they were willing to destroy me to protect their bank accounts. Bradley tapped his expensive fountain pen against the heavy parchment paper. He held it out to me, his smug smile expanding into a full grin. Stop fighting your betters, Zara. Be a good girl. Call the boy out here and sign the papers. I promise I will even let you keep a little allowance for your trouble. Maybe you can finally afford to send him to a real college instead of whatever community college you managed to scrape together tuition for. The sheer level of delusion was almost breathtaking. They truly believed I was a struggling, helpless victim. They had not done a single background check on me or my firm. They had just seen the name Washington associated with a charity event and assumed I was a low-level event planner using their precious surname. They had absolutely no idea that my venture capital firm managed over $2 billion in assets, or that Julian was currently completing a dual degree at Stanford while running his own predictive analytics company. I let out a slow, measured breath. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Every guest, every server, every investor waited with bated breath to see how I would respond to this spectacular public humiliation. I looked at Bradley, then my mother, then Chloe. I let the silence stretch out until Bradley's smug smile began to falter just a fraction. You want me to sign your papers? I asked softly. Bradley straightened his posture, recovering his arrogance. Yes. Now. I slowly reached into my designer evening bag. My mother leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation, expecting me to pull out a silver pen to summon my son to surrender everything to them. She practically held her breath, waiting for my absolute submission. Instead, I entirely bypassed the expensive pens I carried inside. I wrapped my fingers around the cold, smooth metal of my smartphone. I pulled the device out deliberately, holding it up under the bright stage lights, for everyone to clearly see my next move. The screen illuminated my face as I tapped a single contact and hit the speaker icon. The rhythmic ringing echoed loudly through the dead-silent ballroom, amplified by my tiny lapel microphone. My father shifted uncomfortably from side to side while Bradley maintained his arrogant smirk, clearly convinced I was bluffing. On the third ring, a crisp, professional voice filled the massive space. Good evening, Ms. Washington. The acquisition documents have been fully executed and filed with the state authorities. Is there anything else you require tonight? Thank you, Marcus, I said, keeping my eyes locked on Bradley. Just confirming the final details. The Ritz-Carlton management team has been notified of the ownership transfer, correct? Yes, ma'am. Your venture capital firm is now the majority stakeholder of this hotel property. The gala expenses have been cleared through your personal foundation accounts. Excellent work. Have a good night. I tapped the screen and slid the phone back into my evening bag. The silence in the room had shifted from shocked anticipation to a heavy, suffocating tension. My mother blinked rapidly, trying to process the information, while Chloe looked between Bradley and me with growing panic. Bradley let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. You bought a hotel? Bradley sneered, shaking his head in disbelief. How very newly rich of you, Zara. Do you think owning the building changes the legal weight of a generational trust document? Real wealth is protected by law, not by real estate stunts. I have the entire Sinclair family legal team on retainer. They have represented old money interests in Atlanta for over a century. If you do not produce your son right now, I will have them file injunctions against every single asset you own by tomorrow morning. You will be tied up in litigation until you are bankrupt. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He was so predictable. His entire identity was wrapped up in the power of his family name, a name that had been coasting on past glories for decades. The Sinclair legal team, I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue. You mean Sinclair and Associates, the prestigious century-old firm located on Peachtree Street. The very same, Bradley replied, puffing out his chest. And they will crush you. That is fascinating, Bradley, I said, projecting my voice clearly for the crowd. Because my venture capital firm finalized the total acquisition of Sinclair and Associates at 8 o'clock this morning. They were drowning in debt and begged for a buyout to avoid a collapse. I signed the final transfer papers over a cup of coffee. Bradley's face drained of all color. The smug arrogance melted away, replaced by a look of sheer terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Chloe grabbed his arm, shaking him, demanding to know if I was lying. My father took a step backward, looking like he might faint. You are standing on my property, I continued, my voice slicing through the air like a sharp blade, threatening me with a team of lawyers who report to my board of directors. Your precious court order means nothing, because your own legal representation is now funded by my bank accounts. You hold zero power here. The collective gasp from the audience was audible. Several prominent investors in the front row began to chuckle at the dismantling of Bradley's inflated ego. My mother stepped forward, her face twisted with a mixture of rage and desperate denial. You cannot do this to us, Zara! Patricia shrieked, her carefully maintained socialite facade shattering completely. We are your family. We gave you absolutely everything. You are nothing but a disgraceful runaway who got incredibly lucky. You owe your father that trust fund money right now. I owe you absolutely nothing, I said, gesturing firmly to my private security team. Escort these uninvited trespassers off my property immediately. If they actively resist, call the local authorities and press formal trespassing charges. 6 highly trained security guards descended rapidly upon the stage, immediately surrounding my biological family. Bradley attempted to violently shove one of the guards away, but was swiftly and forcefully restrained, his highly expensive suit jacket wrinkling as they securely grabbed his arms. Chloe began crying hysterically, burying her face deep in her hands, as the harsh reality of their public humiliation fully set in. My father simply hung his head in absolute defeat, allowing the muscular guards to physically guide him down the stage stairs. But Patricia absolutely refused to go quietly. As 2 large guards gripped her arms to forcefully escort her away, she fought back viciously, thrashing her body and screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. Her elegant fur coat slipped entirely off her shoulders, dragging pitifully on the floor as they forcefully hauled her down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. Hundreds of elite guests eagerly pulled out their smartphones, actively recording her spectacular meltdown. You think you have won? Patricia screamed, her voice turning shrill and deeply demonic as she aggressively fought the guards. You think you can just throw us away like garbage? I will physically go to the press tomorrow morning. I will tell every single news station in Atlanta exactly who you really are. I will publicly expose your shameful teenage pregnancy. I will loudly tell them you are a greedy, bitter monster who is intentionally letting her own sister die of organ failure. I will completely destroy your reputation, Zara. I will burn your precious company to the ground. I will make sure you lose every single thing you have ever built. The sharp click of my heels against the polished concrete floor echoed through the VIP parking garage of my corporate headquarters. The morning air was crisp and carried the faint scent of expensive coffee and motor oil. I had just stepped out of my private elevator, expecting the usual quiet solitude before the morning market bell. Instead, a sudden movement from the shadows near my reserved parking space caught my attention. Harold, Patricia, Chloe, and Bradley stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, blocking my path to the building entrance. They looked significantly worse than they had the night before. Patricia's hair lacked its usual perfect volume, and Harold's designer suit looked completely rumpled, as if he had slept in it. They had bypassed security by sneaking in behind a delivery truck, an act of desperation that told me they had spent the entire night panicking over the reality of their situation. I stopped walking, holding my leather briefcase loosely at my side. I did not reach for my phone or call for security immediately. I wanted to see what their next strategy would be now that their attempt at public intimidation had failed so spectacularly. Chloe immediately launched into her new performance. She stumbled forward, falling to her knees right in front of me on the cold garage floor. Heavy tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob that echoed off the concrete walls. "Zara, please, you have to listen to me," she cried, clutching her chest dramatically. "I am dying, Zara. I was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney failure 3 months ago. My doctors say I only have a few weeks left unless I get a transplant. We ran tests on everyone in the family, and nobody is a match. Nobody except Julian. Our private investigators obtained his medical records, and he is the exact biological match I need. You cannot let me die, Zara. You cannot let your own flesh and blood perish when your son has the power to save my life. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Just bring him to the hospital and let him do the right thing." My mother stepped up behind Chloe, placing a comforting hand on her trembling shoulder. Patricia looked at me with eyes full of fabricated maternal sorrow. "Please, Zara." Patricia pleaded, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "We know we made mistakes in the past, but this is a matter of life and death. You must convince your son to be the donor. It is his duty to save his aunt." Harold nodded vigorously in agreement, adding that a true family puts aside their differences in times of severe medical crisis. I stood there looking down at my older sister who was still sobbing on the filthy garage floor. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I did not feel pity or sadness. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound disgust. They had realized their legal threats were entirely useless against my corporate power, so they immediately pivoted to emotional manipulation. They were using a fabricated terminal illness to gain access to my son. I looked Chloe dead in the eyes, watching her tears mix with the dirt on the floor. "Get up off the ground, Chloe," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "Your performance is pathetic, and your medical narrative is completely insulting to anyone who has ever actually suffered. You do not have kidney failure. You look perfectly healthy despite your ruined mascara. But more importantly, do you honestly believe I would ever let you within 100 miles of my son?" Chloe sniffled, looking up at me with wide, innocent eyes. "I am telling the truth, Zara," she whimpered. "Why would I lie about dying?" I let out a harsh laugh that made my father flinch. "You lie because it is the only language you people speak," I replied sharply. "But let us talk about medical emergencies since you brought the subject up. Let us talk about what this family actually does when someone is facing a life or death situation." I took a step closer, forcing Chloe to shrink back against Patricia. "Do you remember when I was 14 years old, I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous level. Do you remember when my appendix ruptured in the middle of the night? I was screaming in absolute agony on the bathroom floor. The doctors at the emergency room said I needed immediate surgery or the infection would kill me. They asked for the copay up front because Dad had cheaped out on our insurance policy. But the emergency medical fund account was completely empty." "Do you remember why it was empty, Chloe?" She looked away, refusing to make eye contact. "I will tell you why," I continued, my voice echoing through the silent garage. "Because Mom and Dad had drained my emergency medical fund that very morning to buy you a brand new Porsche for your 18th birthday. You threw a massive tantrum because the neighbor got a BMW and you just had to have something better. So they took the money meant to save my life and bought you a luxury sports car. I had to wait in agonizing pain for 12 hours while they begged a distant relative for a loan to cover the surgery. You drove your shiny new Porsche to the hospital and complained about the parking fees while I was recovering from a near-fatal infection." Bradley abruptly pushed his way forward, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. He completely abandoned his wife's ridiculous medical facade, realizing my walls were entirely impenetrable to their pathetic emotional manipulation. "Fine, you stubborn, ungrateful little witch," Bradley snarled aggressively, stepping uncomfortably close and reaching deep into his custom-tailored jacket to forcefully pull out his thick leather checkbook to assert his absolute financial dominance over me right here and now. Bradley slammed his heavy leather checkbook down onto the pristine hood of my custom Aston Martin. The sharp, violent crack of the binding hitting the polished metal echoed loudly through the VIP parking garage. He did not care that he was scratching a vehicle worth significantly more than his current net worth. He only cared about performing his desperate illusion of ultimate power. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he clicked a gold-plated Mont Blanc pen and began furiously scribbling across the top slip of paper. His breathing was heavy and erratic, a stark contrast to the perfectly curated calm image he usually projected in elite social circles. Chloe had finally stopped her fake crying, wiping her completely dry eyes, and watching her husband with a renewed sense of greedy anticipation. Harold and Patricia stepped closer, flanking Bradley, like loyal foot soldiers waiting for their commander to secure the final victory. They truly believed that money was the ultimate weapon. They genuinely believed that absolutely everyone had a price, and that my price was simply a matter of adding enough zeros to a small piece of paper. With a dramatic sweeping flourish, Bradley aggressively ripped the check from the binding. He thrust it forward aggressively, shoving the piece of paper mere inches from my face. $100,000, he announced, his voice dripping with absolute disgusting condescension. Take it, Zara. Take the money and stop being so incredibly selfish. This is an absolute fortune for a woman like you. It is definitely more cash than a fatherless kid could ever dream of seeing in a single lifetime. Use it to pay off your mounting credit card debts, or buy yourself a little condo in a decent blue-collar neighborhood. Just take the cash. Bring Julian to the hospital immediately to sign the generational wealth transfer documents and walk away silently. We are offering you a golden ticket out of your pathetic, struggling existence. You are acting like a petulant child, throwing a massive tantrum when you should be on your knees expressing your profound gratitude. Do you possess any idea how incredibly generous this offer is, considering the absolute lasting shame you brought upon this prestigious family? He waved the check impatiently when I refused to raise my hand to take it. The slip of paper fluttered in the morning breeze, but I remained completely motionless. His face grew redder, the veins in his neck bulging visibly against his tight silk collar. You completely ruined the Washington name 20 years ago. Bradley continued raising his voice until it bounced harshly off the concrete pillars. You utterly humiliated your parents. You destroyed their impeccable standing in the country club. You forced them to constantly endure the whispers and the pitying stares of their wealthy friends because their teenage daughter could not keep her legs closed. They had to cut you out like a cancerous tumor just to survive the intense social fallout. You should be absolutely groveling at our feet, thanking us for even taking the time to track you down and speak to you today. We are offering to graciously clean up your decades-old mess. We are offering to let your illegitimate son actually do something useful with his meaningless life by saving his grandfather's corporate legacy. We are treating you with a level of grace and mercy that you absolutely do not deserve. My mother nodded enthusiastically, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Bradley is absolutely right, Zara. Patricia added her voice, carrying that familiar tone of maternal disappointment that used to crush my spirit when I was a vulnerable child. We are actively trying to be civilized about this situation. We are extending a massive olive branch. You have been holding on to this ridiculous, bitter grudge for 2 full decades. It is completely exhausting to witness. You need to let the past go and focus entirely on what is best for the family right now. $100,000 is more than enough to set you up comfortably for years. Do not let your foolish, stubborn pride ruin this incredible opportunity. Your father and I have suffered enough public embarrassment because of your teenage mistakes. It is time for you to finally make amends and repay the massive debt you owe us for bringing you into this world. Harold quickly chimed in loudly, agreeing that I was being completely unreasonable and that a good, loyal daughter would never hesitate to help her family in a time of extreme financial crisis. I did not yell back at them. I did not attempt to defend my brilliant son or justify my successful life choices. I simply stood there, breathing in the cool morning air, letting their toxic words wash over me like water off a smooth stone. 20 years ago, those exact deeply cruel words would have broken me into a million irreparable pieces. I would have sobbed uncontrollably and begged desperately for their forgiveness. I would have done absolutely anything to feel worthy of their conditional love. But the frightened, desperate 15-year-old girl they had thrown into the freezing snow no longer existed. She had died a long time ago, permanently replaced by the formidable woman standing before them today. A woman forged in fire and built on absolute relentless determination. I did not even look down at the check still trembling in Bradley's sweaty, desperate hand. I kept my eyes completely leveled, looking right past his expensive, tailored shoulder toward the main security entrance of the underground garage. A slow, deeply knowing smirk began to naturally form on my lips. The sight of my calm, confident smile infuriated Bradley even further. "You think this is funny?" he screamed, losing the very last shred of his carefully maintained socialite composure. "You think you can just stand there and mock us after everything we have offered you? I will make sure you never work in this city again, Zara. I will personally make sure you and your bastard son are completely legally and financially destroyed." He took another highly aggressive step forward, raising his hand as if he were actually going to physically force the check into the breast pocket of my tailored blazer. He never got the chance to make physical contact. A sudden, deafening roar violently interrupted his unhinged tirade. The deep, resonant, aggressive growl of a massive V12 engine echoed loudly through the enclosed concrete structure, completely drowning out Bradley's pathetic, empty threats. The heavy mechanical sound vibrated through the floorboards, physically shaking the very ground beneath our feet. Everyone froze instantly. Bradley slowly lowered his hand, his eyes widening in sheer confusion. Chloe gasped loudly, stepping backward and tightly clutching Harold's arm in fear. Slicing smoothly through the dim morning shadows of the parking garage, a pristine matte black Bentley Continental pulled up quietly and stopped directly behind Bradley. A uniformed driver immediately stepped out of the matte black Bentley and jogged swiftly around the front of the vehicle. He respectfully opened the rear passenger door, revealing the immaculate custom leather interior of the luxury sedan. Stepping onto the concrete was a tall, striking young man wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that undoubtedly cost more than Bradley's entire carefully curated wardrobe. This was my son Julian. He moved with a predatory liquid grace that instantly commanded the undivided attention of every single person standing in the VIP parking garage. His posture was perfectly straight, and his dark eyes swept over the tense scene with an intimidatingly sharp intellect. He possessed the exact same cold, unapologetic confidence that I had cultivated over the last 20 long years. Julian did not say a single word as he deliberately closed the distance between the idling Bentley and my parked Aston Martin. He completely ignored the stunned gapes of my biological family, bypassing them entirely to stand directly beside me. He placed a gentle, supportive hand on my shoulder, offering me a small, reassuring nod, before his sharp gaze shifted down to the hood of my car. There, sitting against the polished, expensive paint, was the ridiculous slip of paper Bradley had so aggressively brandished mere moments earlier. Julian reached out and picked up the check between his thumb and forefinger, lifting it to eye level as if he were inspecting a particularly fascinating piece of garbage. He studied the numbers written across the line and let out a dry, hollow laugh. He looked directly at Bradley with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. $100,000, Julian read aloud, letting the amount echo mockingly off the concrete pillars. He shook his head slowly, a look of genuine pity crossing his handsome face. "I was at a philanthropic gala for pediatric oncology last night in San Francisco. I tipped the valet who parked my car more than this just because I genuinely appreciated his strong work ethic. To think you brought this pathetic piece of paper all the way down here believing it was a massive flex of absolute power is genuinely hilarious." With a swift, fluid motion, Julian snapped the thick paper in half. He placed the torn pieces together and ripped them again, letting the shredded remains flutter down like worthless snow to land directly on the toes of Bradley's imported Italian leather shoes. The absolute silence that followed was completely deafening. Bradley stood completely paralyzed, staring down at the shredded confetti of his own arrogance. His jaw worked silently up and down, but his brain was clearly short-circuiting. He had spent his entire privileged life using inherited money as a blunt weapon to force people into submission. to have his ultimate financial weapon so effortlessly destroyed and mocked by a 20-year-old completely shattered his fragile reality. My mother and sister were equally frozen in absolute profound shock. Patricia stared at Julian with wide, unblinking eyes, her mouth hanging slightly open in total disbelief. They had constructed an entire fictional narrative in their heads about exactly who my son was supposed to be. They fully expected a struggling, uneducated, fatherless kid wearing cheap clothes and carrying a massive chip on his shoulder. They anticipated someone they could easily intimidate, dazzle with a tiny fraction of their wealth, and manipulate into signing away a $10 million trust fund. Instead, they were staring at a highly polished, heavily educated tech founder who moved through the world with the absolute certainty of a young king. Julian did not just look wealthy. He exuded the kind of raw, untouchable power that old money families like the Sinclairs spent generations trying to fake but could never truly achieve. Julian smoothly adjusted his silk tie and turned his attention to Chloe, who was still trembling slightly from her failed medical performance. "You must be the aunt with the miraculous disappearing kidney failure," Julian said, his voice laced with surgical precision. "My mother told me about your little ambush plan on my way from the airport. As a current student at Stanford Law, I find your approach legally fascinating. Attempting to extort a signature under the false pretense of a terminal medical emergency constitutes a textbook definition of fraudulent coercion. If you had actually managed to get a legal document in front of me, I would have happily had you indicted for fraud before lunch. But as a co-founder of a predictive analytics firm, I am honestly just insulted by your terrible overall strategy. Our algorithms could have easily told you that trying to intimidate the woman who built a $1 billion venture capital empire from absolutely nothing was a statistically guaranteed failure." The sheer force of his sharp intellect hit them like a physical blow. Julian was completely dissecting their entire pathetic existence with the casual ease of someone swatting away a minor annoyance. He was not intimidated by their lineage, their money, or their sudden toxic demands for family loyalty. He saw right through their fragile facade, and he was entirely, utterly unimpressed by all of them. Patricia finally found her voice, letting out a high-pitched, breathless gasp. "You are at Stanford," she stammered, pointing a visibly shaking finger at him. "You own a tech company. This makes absolutely no sense. You were supposed to be a nobody. You were supposed to need us." Her pathetic admission hung heavily in the stagnant air of the parking garage, completely exposing the toxic truth of their underlying intentions. They did not want a grandson or a nephew. They wanted a desperate pawn they could control. The crushing realization that they had absolutely zero leverage over us finally pushed my father over the edge. Harold stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson as his fragile patriarchal pride completely overrode his remaining common sense. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the rigid authority he had used to terrorize his household for decades. "Listen to me right now, young man," Harold bellowed, pointing a thick, aggressive finger directly at Julian's face. "I do not care what fancy school you attend or what kind of car you drive. I am your grandfather, and you will learn to show proper respect to your elders immediately." Julian did not flinch or take a step backward when Harold raised his voice. Instead, my son casually buttoned his bespoke jacket and offered my red-faced father a look of profound clinical fascination. He stared at Harold as if examining a dying insect under a microscope. "Respect is something earned through integrity and competence," Harold Julian replied, his voice dangerously quiet and perfectly even. "It is certainly not an automatic entitlement granted simply because we share a microscopic fraction of genetic material. You demand respect and obedience based on a bloodline you deliberately severed 2 decades ago. You invoke the concept of family only when it becomes financially convenient for your failing corporate interests. Now I suggest you lower your finger before I have my personal security team escort you off this property for attempted assault." Harold sputtered, completely enraged by the blatant disrespect. "You insolent little brat!" he snarled, taking another aggressive step forward. "You know absolutely nothing about family legacy or duty. I built an empire from the ground up. I am offering you the distinct privilege of participating in that legacy. All you have to do is sign the wealth transfer documents releasing the $10 million trust fund to your Aunt Chloe for her life-saving surgery. It is a simple administrative task honoring your biological heritage. You owe this family your absolute compliance. Julian let out a short, humorless laugh that echoed sharply against the cold concrete walls. You are operating under a massive delusion of adequacy. Harold, he said, shaking his head. Let us examine your demands from a strictly legal perspective since I spent my weekend reviewing applicable corporate statutes. Under the state commercial code, any transfer of generational trust assets requires the unanimous uncoerced consent of all primary beneficiaries. You are attempting to bypass the mandatory waiting period by fabricating a medical emergency to compel an immediate signature under extreme duress. That is a textbook violation of fiduciary duty and an easily provable act of criminal fraud. You operate under the entirely false assumption that I am somehow desperate for your validation or your money. Patricia suddenly stepped forward, her face a mask of fake grandmotherly concern. Julian, please try to understand our position, she pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. Your mother raised you all alone without a father figure to guide you. We only want to give you the family support you have been missing your entire life. We want to welcome you into the Washington household and give you the proper upbringing you deserve. You do not have to be an angry fatherless boy. The audacity of her statement made me want to intervene, but Julian held up his hand, stopping my mother dead in her tracks. He turned to Patricia with a smile that could freeze boiling water. Let me correct your highly flawed narrative, Patricia, Julian said smoothly. I am not a fatherless boy. My father is an incredibly successful venture capitalist based in Silicon Valley. He has been actively involved in my life since the day I was born, providing guidance, support, and genuine affection. He and my mother possess a wonderful, amicable relationship built on mutual respect. Do you want to know the real reason my mother chose not to marry him? My parents exchanged confused, panicked glances, not expecting this revelation. Julian took a step closer, forcing them to shrink back defensively. My mother chose not to marry him because she never wanted to depend on any man for her survival. Julian declared, his voice ringing with pride. She experienced firsthand what happens when a toxic patriarch uses money to control and abuse his family. She built her own independent billion-dollar empire from nothing, just to ensure I would never have to grovel for scraps at the table of a tyrant like you. She gave me everything. You have absolutely nothing of value to offer me. Harold swallowed hard, his face draining of its angry color, as the reality of Julian's vast resources finally registered. We are still your family, Harold muttered weakly, his previous bravado completely vanishing. We are facing a difficult situation and we need your help. The $10 million from the trust fund will save Chloe's life. It is the honorable thing to do. Julian tilted his head, his dark eyes locking onto Harold's sweating face. That brings me to the most interesting part of this little morning intervention, Julian stated, his tone dropping to a conversational murmur. You see, I have a peculiar habit of doing deep-dive financial analysis for fun. Call it hobby reading. Last night, while flying here on my private jet, I decided to review the publicly available corporate tax filings for Washington enterprises over the last 5 fiscal quarters. Bradley suddenly flinched, his eyes darting nervously toward the exit. Harold remained frozen, a visible bead of sweat rolling down his wrinkled temple. I noticed a massive, highly illegal discrepancy in your offshore and onshore subsidiary accounts, Julian continued relentlessly. You have been aggressively misreporting your revenue streams to inflate your corporate valuation while simultaneously hiding massive operational losses. The debt ratios are completely unsustainable. Washington Enterprises is not just struggling today, Harold. Your company is mathematically bankrupt and currently under imminent and immediate threat of federal investigation for severe tax evasion. The silence that blanketed the garage was absolute and suffocating. Chloe whimpered softly, pressing her face into Bradley's shoulder. Patricia stared in terror, realizing their empire was built on a foundation of fraud. Julian slid a pair of designer sunglasses onto his face and turned his back, completely dismissing their existence. The $10 million trust fund is not for Chloe's fake kidney failure, is it? You desperately need my signature to secure cash to pay off your federal tax penalties before the government seizes your precious estate. Good luck with indictments, Harold. Julian opened the Bentley door for me. I smiled and slid inside, closing the door on my past. The drive back to the office was silent but satisfying. However, cornered animals are the most dangerous creatures. Harold, facing federal indictment and total financial ruin, knew private intimidation was useless against Julian's sharp intellect. They needed leverage that circumvented logic and the law. They needed public outrage. Within 48 hours of our encounter in the parking garage, they found their perfect weapon in the form of daytime television. The Washingtons secured a prime guest spot on a notoriously sensational Atlanta morning talk show known for exploiting emotional family drama for cheap ratings. They bypassed all journalistic integrity by offering an exclusive tragic sob story that the producers simply could not resist. I watched the broadcast from the massive flat screen in my executive boardroom. Patricia and Chloe sat on plush yellow armchairs, looking appropriately devastated for the cameras. Chloe wore a beige, oversized cardigan that washed out her complexion and utilized minimal makeup to emphasize her fabricated illness. She clutched a crumpled tissue with trembling hands. The host leaned forward with exaggerated sympathy as Chloe spun her web of lies. She looked directly into the camera lens and sobbed that she had only a few weeks left to live. She claimed that the only compatible organ donor in the entire world was her estranged nephew, Julian. Then Patricia took over the narrative. My mother wept openly, wiping away fake crocodile tears as she painted me as a bitter, vengeful, and ruthless billionaire. She told the millions of viewers that I was holding a 20-year-old teenage grudge. She claimed I was actively blocking my son from saving his dying aunt out of pure spite, because I cared significantly more about my corporate wealth than my own flesh and blood. Bradley sat in the studio audience looking like the ultimate grief-stricken, supportive husband, while Harold provided the silent, stoic background presence of a heartbroken patriarch. Patricia continued her masterful performance by detailing how they had humbled themselves before me. She told the sympathetic host they had flown across the country, begged on their hands and knees, and even offered me a massive financial settlement just to cover medical expenses. She skillfully twisted Bradley's disgusting garage bribe into an act of desperate familial charity. According to their televised narrative, I had laughed in their faces, mocked Chloe's terminal diagnosis, and driven away in a luxury vehicle while leaving them to literally die in the street. The studio audience gasped in synchronized horror. The host looked directly into the camera and asked how anyone could be so cold and callous to their own family. Chloe finished the segment by looking right down the lens, begging Julian to watch the broadcast and defy his cruel mother to do the honorable thing. The public backlash was immediate and absolutely ferocious. Before the morning broadcast even concluded, my name was the #1 trending topic across all major social media platforms. Hashtags labeling me a corporate monster and demanding I save Chloe dominated the internet. My personal inbox was quickly flooded with intense hate mail and graphic death threats from enraged strangers who had completely bought into the Washingtons' fabricated tragedy. The public relations department of my venture capital firm went into absolute immediate meltdown. My chief of communications stormed into my office looking completely pale and terrified. She informed me that 3 of our largest institutional investors had called within the hour, threatening to pull their massive funding if the situation was not immediately resolved. Corporate stakeholders absolutely despise negative public sentiment, and being painted as a heartless billionaire letting a family member die was the ultimate public relations nightmare. The board of directors demanded an emergency meeting, strongly insisting I release a sympathetic statement immediately to control the narrative. Across town, in the penthouse suite of a luxury hotel they could not actually afford, the Washingtons were busy aggressively celebrating. My private security team reported that Bradley had ordered 3 bottles of vintage champagne to their room immediately following the broadcast. They were toasting to their perceived ultimate victory. They firmly believed that mounting corporate pressure and fierce societal outrage would rapidly force my hand. They assumed that my board of directors would compel me to surrender simply to save the company's stock price. In their incredibly narrow minds, immense wealth was entirely dependent on fragile public perception. They thought they had finally found the one pressure point that could break my ironclad defenses. They were eagerly waiting for my public relations team to issue the standard groveling apology. They fully expected me to quietly bring Julian to the negotiation table to avoid a permanent stain on my professional legacy. My chief of communications placed a carefully drafted press release on my heavy oak desk. It was a standard corporate apology filled with weak deflections and empty promises of family reconciliation. I picked up the expensive stock paper and calmly dropped it directly into the mechanical shredder beside my desk. The machine whined loudly as it chewed the pathetic compromise into tiny, meaningless pieces. I did not build a billion-dollar empire by cowering to public opinion or surrendering to manipulative bullies, I told my terrified staff. I instructed my team to completely ignore the drafted apologies and traditional media outlets. Instead, I ordered my technology department to immediately set up a high-definition global live stream directly from our corporate headquarters. I bypassed the mainstream news networks entirely, setting up a completely direct feed to all of our various social media channels. I was definitely not going to issue a standard apology or hide behind cowardly corporate lawyers. I was going to address the millions of angry viewers directly. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, staring at the sprawling city skyline below. I was absolutely ready for this battle. The Washingtons desperately wanted a massive public spectacle. I was about to give them an execution they would never ever forget. Revenge was finally starting. The flash of 100 camera lenses temporarily blinded me as I stepped up to the acrylic podium at the front of the main conference hall. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with aggressive journalists and eager commentators who had come specifically to watch a titan fall. They gripped their digital recorders and angled their microphones with predatory anticipation. The collective energy in the room was entirely hostile. They had all watched the morning broadcast and bought into the manufactured narrative of the bitter, wealthy sister hoarding her resources while her poor sibling suffered. I could see the judgmental sneers on their faces. They were absolutely ready to vilify me. They expected me to lower my head, issue a carefully worded apology, and pledge millions to a charitable foundation to save face. My chief of communications stood nervously by the side door, silently praying I would stick to the teleprompter. I ignored the glowing screen completely. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat against the cool edges of the podium, and let the harsh murmurs of the crowd completely die down. I did not offer a single word of greeting or a defensive justification for my actions. Instead, I reached out and pressed a single button on the master control console. The overhead lighting instantly dimmed, plunging the massive hall into darkness. A massive digital projector hummed to life, illuminating the wall behind me with a stark black and white image. I had tasked my premier security analyst with retrieving this specific file from the county hospital archives years ago, keeping it securely locked in my private digital vault for a moment exactly like this. The reporters shifted in their seats, murmuring in sudden confusion, as a timestamp from exactly 20 years ago flashed across the bottom right corner of the screen. The silent, grainy video began to play, displaying the exterior entrance of the local emergency room during the worst winter storm of that decade. Heavy snow whipped violently across the camera lens, obscuring the background. Then a small, fragile figure entered the frame. It was a 15-year-old girl wearing a thin, torn jacket that offered absolutely no protection against the freezing blizzard. That girl was me. I was heavily pregnant, physically exhausted, and clutching my swollen stomach as I trudged agonizingly through knee-deep snow toward the hospital doors. The entire press pool gasped collectively as the footage clearly captured me stumbling and falling to my knees in the freezing slush. I struggled violently to get back up, completely alone in the unforgiving elements. Seconds later, a sleek, recognizable luxury sedan slid smoothly into the frame. The heavy vehicle effortlessly cut through the snow directly parallel to where I was struggling on the frozen sidewalk. The camera quality was poor, but the harsh overhead streetlights illuminated the driver perfectly. It was Harold Washington wearing his signature custom suit, driving his pristine vehicle. The reporters leaned forward, completely captivated by the silent tragedy unfolding on the massive screen. The sedan slowed down, but it did not stop to offer assistance. Instead, the rear passenger window slowly rolled down. The camera automatically zoomed in and enhanced the footage, clearly revealing a teenage Chloe sitting comfortably in the heated leather-back seat. She looked directly down at her pregnant, freezing sister struggling for her life in the snow. Chloe pointed her gloved finger at me, threw her head back and openly laughed at my extreme suffering before rolling the window back up and disappearing into the night. The video abruptly faded to black and the bright overhead conference light snapped back on. The silence in the massive room was absolute and profoundly heavy. The previously aggressive journalists stared at the blank screen with their mouths hanging open, completely horrified by the undeniable cruelty they had just witnessed. The righteous indignation they had carried into the room evaporated instantly, entirely, replaced by sickening realization. The Washingtons had presented themselves as a loving, desperate family on national television, but the unarguable digital proof exposed them as callous monsters. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces, maintaining my calm, icy composure. That was my biological family. 20 years ago. I stated cleanly into the cluster of microphones, my voice echoing through the dead silent hall. That was the exact moment I realized I was completely alone in this world. My father and sister watched me nearly freeze to death while in labor and found it highly amusing. They did not care if I survived the night. They are currently staging a massive public relations media tour, demanding my loyalty and my resources. But let me make this absolutely clear to everyone watching today. My family does not want reconciliation. They do not want a relationship with my son. They just want a human ATM. I stared down the top journalists, daring them to challenge the truth I had just presented. The carefully constructed narrative of the desperate Washington family was completely shattered, broken by the harsh reality of their own historical actions. My firm had been under immense pressure just an hour ago, but now the narrative had violently shifted in my favor. I could see the reporters furiously typing on their digital devices, scrambling to break the new angle of the story. The absolute silence was finally broken by the frantic clicking of keyboards and the sudden shifting of heavy camera equipment. I began to gather my notes, preparing to step down from the podium and let the devastating footage speak entirely for itself. I had effectively dismantled their emotional manipulation in front of the entire world. I took a step backward, adjusting my blazer to signal the swift conclusion of the broadcast. Suddenly, a loud single voice cut sharply through the chaotic murmuring of the press pool. A persistent veteran reporter in the front row aggressively thrust his digital recorder forward, refusing to let the conference end just yet. "But what about your sister's failing kidneys?" he shouted. The loud inquiry hung in the stifling air of the conference room, vibrating against the walls like a struck tuning fork. I did not dignify the reporter's aggressive outburst with an immediate response. Instead, I took a deliberate step back from the acrylic podium, allowing the heavy silence to stretch until the room felt entirely suffocated by anticipation. I simply turned my head toward the side stage where my son was already moving. Julian stepped forward, emerging from the shadows of the wings with the calm, terrifying grace of an apex predator closing in on its trapped prey. He walked directly to the center stage, carrying a sleek silver laptop under his right arm. He did not look like a college student caught in a vicious family crossfire. He looked like a seasoned corporate executioner ready to deliver the final lethal blow to the Washington Empire. Julian placed his computer on the smooth surface of the podium and produced a small black interface cable connecting his device directly to the massive projection system. He typed a complex password into his machine, his fingers flying across the illuminated keyboard with practiced mechanical precision. The reporters pushed eagerly against the velvet security ropes, their camera lenses tracking his every calculated movement. The aggressive journalist who had shouted the question about the failing kidneys thrust his microphone higher, demanding an answer. Julian paused his typing and looked directly at the man with an expression of profound clinical amusement. He adjusted the microphone stand downward, bringing it to his exact height. My son possessed my unwavering composure, but he delivered it with a ruthless modern edge that the Washingtons could never possibly comprehend or counter. That is a fascinating question, Julian announced, his smooth voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the packed room. He clicked a final button on his keyboard. Let us examine the heartbreaking medical tragedy of my dear Aunt Chloe. The massive screen behind us flickered briefly before displaying a high-resolution scan of a highly classified medical dossier. The document was completely unredacted, displaying official hospital letterheads, authorized physician signatures and dates spanning the last 36 months. Julian picked up a laser pointer and directed a bright green dot toward the center of the projected page. The room fell so completely quiet that the hum of the electronic projector sounded like a jet engine. The reporters squinted at the glowing text, desperately trying to decipher the complex medical terminology before Julian translated it for them. According to the emotional daytime television interview broadcast this morning, Chloe Washington is tragically suffering from end-stage renal failure. Julian stated, his tone dripping with acidic sarcasm. However, these certified records from the exclusive Beverly Hills Surgical Center paint a vastly different and significantly more superficial picture. The green laser dot circled a series of highlighted diagnostic codes. Chloe does not have failing kidneys. Her vital organs are functioning with absolutely perfect physiological efficiency. She is, however, suffering from a severe, unyielding addiction to elective cosmetic enhancements. The green dot moved swiftly down the page, highlighting a staggering list of procedures. Over the past 3 years, she has undergone 4 intensive rhinoplasties, 2 major facial reconstructive procedures, extensive liposuction, and a series of experimental cellular rejuvenation therapies that are not even legally approved in this country. A collective gasp rippled through the dense crowd of journalists as the undeniable reality of the situation washed over them. The tragic dying sister narrative was not just an exaggeration. It was a complete and absolute fabrication engineered entirely to extort money. Julian pressed the right arrow key on his laptop, seamlessly transitioning to the next damning slide. This new document was a comprehensive financial ledger detailing Chloe's personal accounts. The numbers displayed on the screen were absolutely staggering. Because her insurance providers universally categorized these endless procedures as entirely elective and medically unnecessary. Chloe was forced to pay out of pocket, Julian explained, gesturing to a massive column of negative numbers. She currently possesses a staggering trail of severely delinquent medical debt totaling just over $3 million. She has completely mortgaged her private estate, liquidated her personal trusts, and exhausted every single line of available credit just to fund her dangerous cosmetic obsession. The journalists began shouting questions simultaneously, the room erupting into a frenzy of flashing cameras and chaotic noise. They realized they had been completely manipulated by the Washington's tearful morning broadcast. The media had been played for fools, and their professional outrage was now entirely directed at the fraudulent family who had sold them a fake terminal illness. I watched the live feed of the press conference broadcasting on the secondary monitor, noting how the public comments scrolling across the bottom of the screen had shifted from attacking me to viciously tearing apart Chloe and Patricia. The internet was merciless when it discovered it had been lied to. Julian raised his hand, demanding silence, and the room obediently quieted down, desperate for the next piece of this explosive puzzle. He was conducting the room like a maestro leading a symphony of destruction. You might wonder why a wealthy family resorts to begging for my mother's money to cover cosmetic debts. Julian continued pacing across the stage. You might wonder why they needed a $10 million generational trust fund released immediately, bypassing legal waiting periods. The truth is, that Chloe's unpaid surgical bills are a tiny symptom of a much larger corporate disease infecting Washington enterprises. Julian returned to the podium, placing both hands firmly on the edges. The green laser pointer clicked off. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of cold, calculating wrath. The Washingtons did not come here to save a dying woman. They did not come here to reunite a broken family. They came to execute a desperate corporate heist. He pressed the keyboard key. Let me show you the true destination of the $10 million that they were trying to steal. The enormous projector screen flickered momentarily before displaying a complex, highly detailed financial flowchart connecting dozens of offshore accounts. Julian turned his attention back to the captivated audience of journalists. He began by formally introducing his beloved Uncle Bradley Sinclair to the room. For years, the Sinclair family name had been synonymous with old money prestige, elite country clubs, and generational wealth. Bradley was paraded around Atlanta high society as the ultimate golden boy who had graciously married into the Washington family, bringing with him a supposed empire of untellable riches. Julian let out a dark, echoing laugh that sent a visible chill through the silent room. He clicked his presentation remote, and a heavy black and white legal document materialized on the glowing screen. It was a finalized federal bankruptcy filing dated exactly 3 years ago. Julian paced slowly across the stage, ensuring every single reporter had ample time to photograph the damning evidence. The legendary Sinclair fortune is a complete and absolute myth, he declared, his voice ringing with undeniable authority. 3 years ago, the Sinclair family quietly filed for total Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Their historic estates were quietly foreclosed upon by aggressive creditors. Their famous investment portfolios were entirely liquidated to pay off catastrophic toxic debts. Bradley Sinclair did not bring a vast fortune into his marriage with my Aunt Chloe. He brought a mountain of degenerate gambling debts and severe legal liabilities. He is completely mathematically broke. The press pool erupted in a renewed wave of frantic whispering. Julian raised his hand, demanding their full attention for the next phase of his execution. He advanced the slide, revealing a dense forensic accounting report highlighting the internal banking servers of Washington enterprises. He pointed his laser directly at a massive red column of outgoing wire transfers. Bradley Sinclair was hired as a senior vice president of acquisitions by my grandfather Harold. This gave him unrestricted access to the primary real estate holding accounts. Over the past 24 months, Bradley systematically embezzled exactly $8 million from the corporate treasury. He routed the stolen capital through a sophisticated maze of anonymous shell companies located in the Cayman Islands directly into the pockets of his aggressive creditors. He drained his own father-in-law's company dry just to maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. Camera shutters clicked furiously, capturing the undeniable proof of massive corporate fraud. Julian leaned heavily against the acrylic podium, locking eyes with the front row of journalists. A normal corporate executive would immediately contact the federal authorities upon discovering an $8 million internal theft, he stated smoothly. A normal father would throw his embezzling son-in-law directly into a federal penitentiary. But we are not talking about normal people. We are talking about Harold and Patricia Washington. They are entirely obsessed with maintaining their fragile elite social standing. A scandal of this colossal magnitude would result in an immediate catastrophic crash of their corporate stock. It would trigger an aggressive investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission and get them permanently blacklisted from every high society circle in the state. They could not afford the truth to be exposed. Julian advanced to the final slide. It showed a simple mathematical equation breaking down the exact sum of $10 million. So they engineered a desperate, coordinated criminal conspiracy. Julian explained, his tone dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper. They needed exactly $8 million in untraceable liquid cash to silently replace the embezzled corporate funds before the quarterly audits caught the massive discrepancy. They needed an additional $2 million to instantly erase Chloe's staggering cosmetic surgery debts before her private estate was seized. They needed exactly $10 million to save their collapsing house of cards, and they knew exactly where that money was sitting. The collective realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The reporters finally understood the entire sinister architecture of the Washington's master plan. The fake terminal illness, the dramatic television interviews, the emotional manipulation regarding a dying sister. It was all a carefully fabricated theatrical performance designed to extort a teenage trust fund. They tried to weaponize public empathy to steal my money and cover up their own massive criminal enterprise, Julian declared firmly. They used the sacred concept of family as a blunt instrument of financial fraud. My mother survived their cruelty 2 decades ago, and she built an empire entirely without them. I will not allow them to use her hard-earned legacy to fund their pathetic illegal charade. Julian reached over and closed his laptop with a sharp, definitive snap. The massive screen behind him instantly went dark. He looked directly into the primary broadcast camera lens, addressing the perpetrators, who he knew were watching live. I have already forwarded every single unredacted financial document, every forensic accounting report, and every piece of security footage directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. You wanted the world's attention, Harold. Now you officially have it. Julian stepped away from the podium, entirely ignoring the explosive tidal wave of shouted questions from the desperate press pool. He walked calmly off the stage, leaving a permanently altered narrative in his wake. Miles away in the opulent penthouse suite of a luxury downtown hotel, the atmosphere had shifted from arrogant celebration to absolute suffocating terror. The 3 vintage champagne bottles sat completely untouched on the marble coffee table. Harold stood frozen in the center of the room, his face entirely drained of color as he stared blankly at the television screen. Patricia clutched her chest, gasping for air, as her carefully maintained world violently imploded around her. Bradley remained completely paralyzed on the velvet sofa, his eyes wide with the realization that his financial crimes were now public knowledge. Chloe sobbed uncontrollably, no longer faking her distress, as the weight of federal prison suddenly became a terrifying reality. They had vastly underestimated their opponent, and now they were going to pay the ultimate price. The heavy silence in the lavish suite was suddenly broken by a harsh, rhythmic, sweeping pattern illuminating the dark walls. Patricia slowly turned her head toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, her entire body trembling violently. The bright, aggressive reflection of flashing red and blue police lights bounced violently against the glass, completely filling the room with the undeniable glow of impending justice. The flashing lights belonged to a passing ambulance racing down the avenue, but the panic it induced triggered a frantic retreat. Harold quickly dragged his hyperventilating wife and sobbing daughter out of the luxury hotel suite through a private service elevator. They fled the city center like common criminals speeding through the dark streets until the heavy iron gates of their Buckhead mansion closed behind them. However, the perceived safety of their massive ancestral fortress offered absolutely zero comfort. The second the heavy mahogany front door slammed shut, the suffocating tension in the opulent foyer instantly ignited into pure, uncontrolled violence. Harold Washington, the carefully curated patriarch of elite society, completely lost his legendary composure. He let out a guttural, animalistic roar and lunged directly across the expensive marble floor. He violently grabbed his son-in-law by the lapels of his custom-tailored suit and slammed Bradley aggressively against the ornate entryway wall. An antique mirror crashed to the floor, shattering into hundreds of jagged pieces around their expensive leather shoes. "You parasitic thief!" Harold screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he pinned the younger man against the expensive wallpaper. "I welcomed you into my private home. I handed you my only daughter. I gave you the keys to my corporate empire, and you completely gutted me like a fish. You stole $8 million from my legacy to pay off your degenerate gambling debts. You have destroyed my entire life's work. You manipulated my trust and weaponized my own company against me. You are going to take the full legal fall for this massive embezzlement, Bradley. I will serve you up to the federal prosecutors on a silver platter just to save my own skin." Bradley did not cower in fear this time. The polished, deferential son-in-law facade evaporated entirely, replaced by the cornered desperation of a man facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He shoved Harold backward, sending the older man stumbling into a velvet bench. "Do not you dare try to put this entire criminal conspiracy on me." Bradley spat viciously, his chest heaving as he straightened his ruined designer jacket. "I was completely drowning the moment I married into this fake superficial family. You demand absolute perfection. You demand a lavish lifestyle that nobody can actually sustain without cutting corners. Do you have any realistic idea what it actually costs to keep your precious spoiled princess happy?" He pointed a shaking finger directly at Chloe, who was huddled on the sweeping staircase wiping smeared mascara from her cheeks. "Tell your father the ugly truth," Chloe Bradley demanded, his voice echoing sharply off the vaulted ceilings. "Tell him about the secret luxury trips to Beverly Hills. Tell him about the six-figure credit card bills you routinely hid in my name just to buy limited edition bags and shoes you wore exactly once." She demanded a life of absolute royalty, Harold. She needed to be the undisputed queen of the Buckhead social scene. When my personal money dried up, she threatened to file for divorce and publicly expose my initial financial struggles to all your precious country club friends. I embezzled that corporate money to keep your ruthless daughter from destroying me. I stole to fund her insatiable vanity and her obsession with keeping up appearances. Chloe leapt to her feet, her face contorted in hysterical rage. She grabbed a heavy brass statue from a display pedestal and hurled it wildly across the grand foyer. It smashed into the drywall just inches from Bradley's head, leaving a deep, jagged crater in the plaster. "You pathetic coward!" she shrieked, her voice cracking hysterically. "You promised me the entire world. You claimed you were a legendary Sinclair. You swore you possessed unlimited generational wealth. You lied to me from the very beginning, just to get access to my father's lucrative corporate accounts. Do not you dare blame my necessary medical treatments on your massive gambling addiction and your fraudulent business investments. You are a complete fraud." While the rest of her broken family tore each other apart like rabid dogs fighting over a scrap of meat, Patricia Washington remained completely paralyzed on a silk entryway chair. The threat of an imminent federal indictment and lengthy prison sentences hung heavily over the room, yet my mother was entirely consumed by a different tragedy. She clutched her mobile phone with a tight grip, scrolling frantically through social media feeds and community message boards. Her breath came in short, hyperventilating gasps as she read the thousands of brutal comments tearing her reputation to shreds. "My annual charity gala." Patricia whimpered, rocking back and forth in a state of absolute shock. "I am supposed to chair the symphony fundraiser next month. The governor's wife just blocked me on Instagram. The country club board is already voting to revoke our membership. I am a public laughingstock. We are completely ruined socially. How can I possibly show my face at the country club ever again?" The legendary Washington family, the supposed pinnacle of elite excellence and generational wealth, had been completely unmasked. The sophisticated facade they had meticulously maintained for decades was gone, leaving only a group of desperate and utterly broken individuals turning on each other like cornered animals. There was absolutely no loyalty remaining in that beautiful mansion. The violent shouting match between Harold and Bradley was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, piercing chime. Harold instinctively reached into his pocket, pulling out his personal smartphone. The bright screen illuminated his terrified face with a harsh, cold glow. His bloodshot eyes widened in absolute horror as he read the automated notification from his bank. The message was explicitly clear and offered zero room for negotiation. If they did not produce exactly $5 million by Friday, the family mansion would go into immediate foreclosure. The digital foreclosure warning paralyzed Harold in his expensive tracks. His violent grip on Bradley immediately loosened as the reality of their shared destruction settled over the opulent foyer. Losing the Buckhead mansion was the ultimate social death sentence. It was the physical manifestation of their elite historical legacy. Without that prestigious address, the Washington family would instantly become irrelevant outcasts. The federal authorities were undoubtedly building a massive criminal case against them right now. However, complex federal investigations took time to execute formal arrest warrants. They had a rapidly closing window of opportunity to survive this imminent disaster together. Harold looked at his disgraced son-in-law with cold calculation. They needed $5 million by Friday. If they could secure that cash, they could save the house and hire a team of elite defense attorneys to fight the impending federal charges. The men quickly formed a desperate and highly illegal alliance born entirely of pure necessity. They knew Zara possessed unlimited liquid capital within her venture capital firm. They just needed a weapon strong enough to forcefully extract it from her. Extortion was their only remaining option. They decided to launch one final devastating legal strike against her. Patricia was ruthlessly ordered to empty her hidden wall safe. She surrendered several unrecorded diamond necklaces and thick stacks of emergency currency. Bradley simultaneously drained his last secret offshore cryptocurrency wallet that he had hidden from his aggressive creditors. Together, they pooled nearly $200,000 in untraceable liquid assets. This capital was not meant for paying off the bank or hiring legitimate legal counsel. It was compiled specifically to bribe a deeply corrupt local judge who frequently golfed with Harold at the exclusive country club. Judge Marcus Vance was a man known for selling judicial favors completely routinely. Vance owed Harold several significant favors for covering up his own scandalous indiscretions years ago. Harold and Bradley sped through the darkened streets toward a deserted underground parking structure downtown. They met the compromised magistrate in the suffocating shadows of the concrete garage. Harold handed over the heavy briefcase containing the bribe. He demanded a fraudulent ex parte asset freeze against Zara and her corporate firm. The manufactured warrant completely reversed the absolute truth. It maliciously claimed that Zara was the individual who committed international wire fraud to illegally steal Julian's generational trust fund capital tonight. The judge eagerly agreed. The corrupt magistrate stamped the forged documents on the hood of his vehicle. The paperwork authorized the immediate seizure of all operational capital held by her venture firm. It was a wildly illegal last-ditch maneuver designed to paralyze her business infrastructure instantly. Harold knew that if he could legally choke off her money supply, she would be forced to negotiate an emergency settlement. He intended to extort exactly $5 million to lift the fraudulent injunction. This dirty money would save his precious mansion and secure high-powered defense lawyers before the federal agents could officially arrest him tomorrow. Armed with this powerful manufactured weapon, Harold felt completely invincible once again. He was no longer a cornered victim awaiting federal prosecution. He was the ruthless patriarch reclaiming total control. Judge Vance made a quick phone call to a specific local police precinct commander, who frequently handled off-the-book operations for wealthy country club members. Within minutes, a private squad of heavily militarized local police officers was entirely mobilized. They operated completely outside of normal federal jurisdiction, unaware that the arrest warrant they were executing was a maliciously purchased fabrication. The trap was now fully set and loaded. Perfectly. Bradley drove Harold aggressively toward the city center. The squad of local police cruisers followed closely behind them with their sirens completely silenced. They did not want to give Zara any advance warning. Harold stared out the passenger window, his mind consumed by vivid fantasies of ultimate revenge. He pictured his estranged daughter being violently dragged out of her pristine luxury penthouse in cold steel handcuffs. He imagined the utter humiliation on her face as her corporate assets were formally seized. He was absolutely determined to break her stubborn independent spirit tonight and forcibly extract his $5 million ransom. The convoy pulled up smoothly outside the towering glass skyscraper where Zara resided. Bradley handed the fake judicial documents to the lead police commander. The heavily armed officers bypassed the stunned lobby concierge by aggressively flashing their shiny silver badges. They commandeered the private express elevator, ascending rapidly toward the top-floor penthouse. Harold felt an intoxicating surge of pure adrenaline rushing through his veins. The devastating public relations disaster earlier that evening was already fading from his immediate memory. He genuinely believed that this desperate, highly illegal maneuver would successfully save his entire elite social status and legacy permanently. Bradley smirked confidently as the elevator doors slid open, revealing the expansive private corridor leading directly to Zara's double mahogany front doors. He knew that once she was locked in a holding cell with her corporate bank accounts completely frozen, she would immediately surrender. She would wire the ransom money just to make the manufactured legal nightmare disappear. The two men stood proudly behind the wall of uniformed police officers fully prepared to witness her glorious downfall. The commander raised his heavy tactical boot, preparing to breach the entrance with overwhelming force. They were both absolutely certain they had won. Harold crossed his arms over his chest, wearing a dark, triumphant scowl. This isolated, localized corruption was his ultimate specialty. He had manipulated the legal system for decades to crush his business rivals and protect his family fortune. He truly believed that his estranged daughter was completely defenseless against this level of weaponized systemic corruption. The intense anticipation hung heavily in the quiet corridor. The commander gave a sharp, silent tactical hand signal to the armed squad. Harold and Bradley watched eagerly as they violently kicked open Zara's doors, entirely confident they had finally trapped her tonight completely without fail. The shattered mahogany doors crashed against the marble floor of my penthouse. Wood shards scattered across the rug as 6 armed police officers stormed through the entrance. They moved with aggressive precision, fanning out with hands resting on holstered weapons. The lead commander, a burly man with a hardened face, marched toward the center of the room. He scanned the luxurious surroundings, his eyes darting past priceless art and panoramic windows, offering a breathtaking view of the Atlanta skyline. He expected to find a terrified criminal frantically shredding documents. Instead, he found me standing completely still beside the grand piano. I was wearing an emerald green evening gown, perfectly composed, watching their chaotic home invasion with detached curiosity. "Zara Washington, you are under arrest for international wire fraud and corporate embezzlement," the commander barked, his voice echoing harshly against the vaulted ceilings. "Turn around slowly and place your hands flat against the small of your back." Before the commander could reach for his restraints, Harold and Bradley swaggered through the ruined doorway. They looked like conquering generals inspecting a vanquished territory. Harold adjusted his custom tie, a triumphant grin stretching across his aging face. He surveyed my home with undisguised contempt, relishing the destruction his corrupt money had purchased. The desperation that consumed him an hour ago was replaced by toxic arrogance. He took a deliberate step past the armed officers, wanting to witness my absolute humiliation. "You really thought you could destroy my legacy and walk away untouched?" Harold sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You are nothing but a pathetic high school dropout who got lucky with a few meaningless startup investments. You honestly believed you could outsmart seasoned businessmen who have controlled this city for decades. You played a dangerous game, Zara, and now you are going to lose absolutely everything. By tomorrow morning, your venture capital firm will be liquidated, your assets legally seized, and you will sit in a federal holding cell wearing an orange jumpsuit." Bradley stepped beside my father, his chest puffed out in a display of manufactured bravado. The sweat from his earlier panic had dried, leaving a false sense of invincibility. "We froze every single one of your corporate accounts 30 minutes ago," Bradley boasted loudly, ensuring the police heard his victorious declaration. The judge signed the asset seizure order without a moment of hesitation. "Your financial infrastructure is paralyzed. If you want to avoid a lengthy prison sentence and a public media crucifixion, you will authorize an immediate $5 million transfer to the Washington corporate treasury right now." You thought you could expose my strategies, but I hold the winning hand. I did not scream in indignation. I did not frantically deny their fabricated criminal allegations. I did not threaten to call defense attorneys or demand to see their dubious warrant. I simply maintained my icy composure. I offered my father and his embezzling son-in-law a serene, chilling smile that failed to reach my eyes. Moving with unhurried grace, I slowly turned around to face the glittering city skyline. I lifted my arms and extended my bare wrists backward, offering them willingly to the aggressive commander. I was entirely ready to be placed in cold steel handcuffs without a single ounce of resistance. My lack of panic sent a ripple of confusion through the squad of armed officers. They were highly trained to handle screaming suspects, violent resistance, and desperate pleas for mercy. They were completely unequipped to deal with a suspect who treated their armed home invasion like a minor predictable inconvenience. Harold frowned, his triumphant grin faltering as he tried to comprehend my peaceful submission. He expected me to beg for a settlement, but I was denying him the satisfaction of a fight. Throughout this chaotic spectacle, Julian had not moved a single muscle. He remained casually leaned against the white quartz surface of the kitchen island, his posture radiating supreme boredom. He was dressed impeccably in a dark tailored suit, unfazed by the presence of 6 armed police officers in our private residence. He held a porcelain cup of freshly brewed espresso in his right hand. He took a slow, deliberate sip, the clinking of the ceramic echoing loudly in the sudden tense silence. He looked between the gloating Washington men and the aggressive police commander with an expression of clinical amusement. He was watching a predictable tragicomedy play out exactly according to his meticulous script. The police commander stepped forward, unhooking the heavy metal handcuffs from his tactical belt. He reached out to grab my extended wrists, eager to conclude the high-profile arrest and claim his corrupt bounty from Judge Vance. "I would strongly advise against completing that specific action, Commander," Julian calmly stated, his smooth, commanding voice cutting through the heavy tension like a perfectly sharpened scalpel. The commander paused, his heavy brow furrowing in deep irritation. He turned his aggressive glare toward the kitchen island, ready to threaten the arrogant young man with an obstruction of justice charge. Julian finally pushed himself off the quartz counter. He set his espresso cup down with a soft, definitive clink. He reached slowly into the interior breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with the lead police officer. He did not pull out a phone or business card. Instead, he produced a black leather credential case. He flipped it open with a sharp flick of his wrist and handed it directly to the local police chief. The heavy silver shield embedded in the leather caught the bright overhead penthouse lights, completely illuminating the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The commander froze, his eyes widening in sudden terror as he registered the profound severity of his catastrophic mistake. "Before you illegally detain a private citizen under false pretenses," Julian instructed, his tone deadly and unforgiving, "I highly recommend you take a very close, extremely thorough look at the forged judicial signature on Bradley Sinclair's fraudulent arrest warrant." The heavy silver badge gleamed under the recessed lighting of the penthouse. The burly police commander stared at the federal credential as if it had suddenly materialized from thin air. He slowly lowered his metal handcuffs, his aggressive demeanor evaporating entirely. He snatched the physical warrant from Bradley Sinclair and held it up to the light. His eyes darted between the supposed signature of Judge Marcus Vance and the cold, unyielding expression on Julian's face. The realization of his catastrophic jurisdictional error hit the commander like a physical blow. He took 2 large, immediate steps backward, putting significant distance between himself and the Washington men who had just orchestrated this spectacular disaster. Harold's face turned a sickening shade of pale gray. He looked frantically at Julian, attempting to comprehend how a seemingly passive bystander possessed federal law enforcement credentials. Bradley began to stutter, stepping nervously toward the elevator bank. They had walked into a meticulously designed fortress, utterly blind to the invisible tripwires they had just triggered. Julian smoothly retrieved his federal badge, slipping it back inside his tailored jacket with practiced ease. He finally took another sip of his espresso, savoring the absolute silence that had descended upon the room. He turned his attention directly to my terrified father. "You thought I was merely a silent financial partner?" Julian stated, his voice echoing cleanly off the marble floors. "You failed to conduct a proper background check. During my years at Stanford, I did not just study advanced financial modeling. I was heavily recruited to work a rather specific side job." I am an elite data analytics consultant for the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I specialize in tracking offshore embezzlement, corporate fraud, and the illicit movement of concealed assets. Bradley let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. He backed into the drywall, his expensive designer suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Julian set his empty cup down on the quartz island and picked up a sleek black tablet. My division flagged Judge Marcus Vance exactly 6 weeks ago, Julian explained, tapping the glowing screen. We noticed a highly suspicious pattern of offshore cryptocurrency transfers coinciding directly with his sudden issuance of ex parte corporate asset freezes. The Bureau knew he was accepting massive bribes from desperate businessmen, but we needed incontrovertible physical evidence to execute a federal indictment. We needed a corrupt actor to physically purchase a fraudulent warrant and attempt to execute it across jurisdictional lines. Julian smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that completely unnerved the armed police squad. By purchasing that fake document in a dark parking garage tonight and bringing it directly into this penthouse, you did not trap Zara. You hand-delivered the exact smoking gun my federal task force required. You committed criminal conspiracy, attempted corporate extortion, and federal wire fraud, all within a single hour. The transaction records from Bradley's secret offshore wallet have already been completely traced and officially seized by the federal government. Harold's legendary composure shattered into a million jagged fragments. He lunged toward Julian, his hands raised in pure, unrestrained desperation. "You cannot do this to me!" Harold screamed, spit flying from his trembling lips. "I am a Washington. I built this city. You are destroying a pillar of the community over a simple misunderstanding. This is a private family dispute regarding internal corporate assets. We can settle this financially right now without any unnecessary federal involvement. I have immense political connections." The police commander did not wait for Julian to decline the pathetic bribe. The local officer realized his own career and freedom were hanging by a dangerously thin thread. He needed to definitively choose the winning side before the federal agents ruined his life alongside the Washington patriarch. The commander aggressively grabbed Harold by the shoulder, spinning the older man around with brutal, unforgiving force. "You are under arrest for federal conspiracy and fraud," the commander barked, slamming Harold roughly against the grand piano. He unhooked the metal handcuffs that were originally intended for me and ratcheted them tightly around my father's wrists. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the penthouse like a beautiful melodic symphony. Two other armed officers immediately tackled Bradley. The cowardly son-in-law did not even attempt to fight back. He collapsed onto the expensive rug, sobbing hysterically as they wrenched his arms behind his back and secured the heavy steel cuffs. The magnificent Washington Empire had completely fallen, dismantled by their own insatiable greed and stunning arrogance. The police began dragging the two disgraced men toward the private express elevator. Harold struggled against the officer's iron grip, his eyes wild with unadulterated terror. He looked back at me, his face twisted in a mask of absolute hatred and utter defeat. He was losing his freedom, his reputation, and his entire identity. Watching them being forcibly removed from my pristine personal sanctuary provided an indescribable wave of deep, incredibly satisfying closure. All those agonizing years of constant emotional abuse, systematic financial manipulation, and cruel psychological torment had finally culminated in this absolute masterpiece of poetic justice. I had successfully and completely destroyed the ruthless monsters who had originally created me. I stepped forward, my emerald gown sweeping softly across the ruined floorboards. I raised my hand, signaling the police commander to halt the procession for one brief final moment. The commander immediately obliged, eager to cooperate with anyone connected to the Federal Bureau. I leaned in extremely close to my father's ear. I could smell the stale sweat of his profound panic. I held up my personal smartphone, the screen brightly illuminating a fresh automated notification from the banking establishment. "I just received a very interesting email regarding your precious Buckhead estate," I whispered, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "You failed to meet the strict $5 million deadline. The bank rejected your extension request. Your ancestral mansion officially went into immediate foreclosure exactly 10 minutes ago. You have absolutely no home to return to, Harold. Exactly 1 month passed since the disastrous penthouse raid permanently dismantled the Washington Empire. Harold and Bradley remain locked securely inside a federal holding facility in downtown Atlanta. The federal magistrate aggressively denied their bail requests due to their extreme flight risk and the overwhelming severity of their massive fraud conspiracy. Without their patriarchal shields, the remaining Washington women face the brutal, unforgiving consequences of complete financial ruin. The legendary Buckhead Mansion, once an impenetrable fortress of generational wealth and elite social dominance, was now the tragic site of a spectacular public humiliation. The morning sun illuminated the utter destruction of a dynasty built entirely on deceit. Bank-ordered movers swarmed the sweeping property like relentless locusts. They possessed absolutely no respect for the fragile elite sensibilities of the former occupants. Burly men in heavy work boots marched through the grand mahogany doors, unceremoniously carrying out decades of meticulously curated luxury. They tossed custom-tailored designer luggage, priceless Persian rugs, and velvet antique furniture onto the pristine manicured grass. A massive crystal chandelier, originally imported from Italy for Patricia and her 50th birthday gala, was haphazardly shoved into a damaged cardboard box. Chloe and her extensive collection of limited edition handbags, the very items Bradley had foolishly embezzled corporate funds to finance, were dumped aggressively onto the driveway like cheap garage sale cast-offs. The movers worked with mechanical efficiency, entirely deaf to the hysterical screaming echoing across the sweeping front lawn. Every piece of expensive porcelain that shattered against the pavement symbolized another broken promise made by the disgraced patriarch. The physical manifestation of their massive historic legacy was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. Patricia dropped to her knees on the damp morning grass, clutching a ruined mink coat tightly against her chest. Her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess, and her expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. She wailed loudly, begging the grim-faced bank representatives to stop the brutal eviction process. She frantically offered them worthless promises of future payments, entirely unable to grasp that her social currency possessed zero actual value. Beside her, Chloe paced aggressively back and forth, frantically dialing numbers on her smartphone with violently trembling fingers. She called her wealthy friends, her prominent socialite connections, and the influential country club board members, desperately seeking an emergency loan, or even just a temporary place to stay. Every single call went directly to voicemail. The toxic arrogance that had defined Chloe throughout her entire existence was completely shattered, replaced by the terrifying realization that she was entirely alone in a world she no longer belonged to. She screamed at the movers, demanding they handle her silk garments with care, but her entitled commands were completely ignored. She was no longer the undisputed queen of Buckhead society. She was simply an evicted tenant, obstructing a legal foreclosure. The neighborhood spectacle attracted significant, devastating attention. The winding suburban street outside the heavy wrought iron gates became an impromptu parade route for the Atlanta elite. Sleek European sports cars and massive luxury vehicles cruised past the estate at agonizingly slow speeds. Inside those tinted vehicles sat the very same country club friends who had eagerly consumed Patricia and her vintage champagne and attended Chloe and her lavish parties just weeks ago. Now, these former allies actively rolled up their windows, pointedly turning their heads away to avoid making direct eye contact with the disgraced women. There were no offers of assistance or sympathetic embraces. The brutal, unspoken rules of high society demanded the immediate and permanent ostracization of anyone tainted by poverty or public scandal. Patricia watched her former tennis partner drive past in a silver convertible, deliberately looking in the opposite direction. The Washington family was utterly dead to them, a tragic cautionary tale to be whispered about over expensive brunches and completely forgotten by the next social season. The intense isolation was infinitely more painful than losing the actual mansion. They had sacrificed Zara and her well-being to protect this specific community, and that community had instantly discarded them without a second thought. Patricia buried her tear-stained face in her hands, violently shaking with uncontrollable sobs as another vintage armchair was carelessly hurled onto the growing pile of discarded wealth. She sobbed for her ruined reputation, her incarcerated husband, and the lavish lifestyle she would never experience again. Chloe finally dropped her useless phone onto the concrete driveway, collapsing onto a pile of ruined silk dresses, completely defeated by her total social annihilation. She stared blankly at the massive iron gates shivering in the brisk morning air, utterly devoid of hope or direction. The crushing reality of their new destitute existence settled heavily over the chaotic scene. They possessed no money, no powerful allies, and absolutely no viable path forward. The grand estate that had shielded their dark secrets for decades was finally purging them from its grounds. Movers continued emptying the massive house, bringing out the last remaining items of value. Expensive oil paintings were stacked carelessly against the stone fountain. Silver dining sets were dumped into plastic bins. The sheer volume of their accumulated wealth only magnified the profound tragedy of their current situation. They had traded their humanity for material possessions, and now they were losing both simultaneously. The bank agent stood by with cold indifference, checking items off their extensive foreclosure lists. Every discarded item represented a stolen dollar, a manipulated investor, or a shattered life. The true cost of the Washington family greed was finally laid bare under the harsh morning sun. The women wept uncontrollably, mourning the spectacular death of their manufactured reality. This was the end of them. Suddenly, the chaotic noise of the eviction was interrupted by a powerful engine roar. A deep, rhythmic rumbling echoed from down the affluent street. A sleek convoy of heavily tinted black vehicles pulled smoothly through the wrought iron gates of the estate, rolling directly toward the crying women with deliberate, terrifying purpose, completely unstoppable. The lead vehicle, a custom armored Maybach with deeply tinted windows, glided to a smooth halt just inches from the scattered piles of ruined designer luggage. The heavy doors opened in perfect synchronization, signaling a definitive shift in the morning's chaotic atmosphere. Julian emerged first, his meticulously tailored charcoal suit catching the bright morning sunlight, radiating an aura of quiet, dangerous, and unparalleled authority. He turned gracefully and extended his hand toward the darkened interior of the luxury vehicle. I stepped out onto the very pavement where I had once been treated as an unwanted, invisible burden. I wore a striking crimson trench coat over a flawless ivory silk suit, my posture perfectly straight, and my expression completely unbothered by the surrounding devastation. We looked like absolute royalty surveying a newly conquered territory. The undeniable inversion of the power dynamic hit the displaced women like a brutal physical shockwave. Patricia and Chloe froze instantly, their hysterical sobbing catching sharply in their throats as they stared at our immaculate arrival. The bank-ordered professional movers paused their relentless clearing of the mansion, sensing the heavy shifting tension in the crisp air. For a fleeting, pathetic second, my mother's bloodshot eyes widened with a desperate flare of delusional hope. She genuinely believed that her estranged, scapegoated daughter had arrived to offer a miraculous financial rescue. The exact same daughter she had ruthlessly alienated, belittled, and allowed to be framed for federal crimes was now her absolute last lifeline. Chloe wiped a thick streak of expensive mascara from her pale cheek, her usual arrogant sneer completely absent. It was rapidly replaced by the hollow, terrified gaze of a spoiled child, suddenly realizing her limitless credit line had permanently expired. The pristine, untouchable matriarch of elite Buckhead society completely shattered right before my eyes. Patricia Washington, the woman who had historically valued country club memberships and superficial appearances over her own flesh and blood, scrambled awkwardly across the damp grass. She literally crawled over a remarkably messy pile of scattered cashmere throw blankets and discarded porcelain vases to reach my polished leather heels. Her manicured fingers, shaking violently with unchecked panic, reached out to grasp the bottom hem of my crimson coat. I took a deliberate, calculated half-step backward, ensuring her desperate hands met only the cold morning air. She collapsed entirely, pressing her tear-stained face against the rough concrete driveway. She wept with a pathetic, agonizing intensity that echoed loudly across the sprawling estate. The glamorous, untouchable illusion she had meticulously protected for decades was officially dead. "Zara, please, you absolutely have to help us," Patricia wailed, her voice cracking pathetically under the immense weight of her total public humiliation. "We are your family. We share the exact same blood. You cannot just stand there in your expensive clothes and watch them throw us onto the unforgiving streets like common worthless criminals. Your father made terrible, unforgivable mistakes, but Chloe and I had absolutely no idea what he was doing behind closed doors. We are innocent victims in his corrupt schemes. We never wanted any of this to happen to our beautiful family. It is a complete nightmare. You possess unlimited corporate capital now. You have that massive venture firm. You can easily afford to fix this catastrophic mess right now." She gestured wildly toward the silent, unyielding bank agents who were observing the pathetic spectacle with clinical detachment. "Just wire the bank the $5 million. Buy the house back from the ruthless foreclosure agency. I am begging you on my hands and knees, do not let them take my home." Chloe stumbled forward, her expensive designer heels snapping off abruptly against the uneven pavement. She fell heavily onto the pavement beside her weeping mother, her insatiable toxic vanity completely stripped away by the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. "She is entirely right, Zara." Chloe sobbed, her voice lacking any of its usual venomous mocking bite. "Bradley ruined my entire existence. He viciously lied about his generational wealth and his prominent legacy. I have absolutely nothing left to my name. My elite credit cards are universally declined, and my so-called best friends will not even answer my desperate text messages. We are sisters. You cannot let your own sister become homeless and destitute. Just pay the greedy bank agents, and we will do whatever you want. We will follow your rules, we will apologize, we will be the perfect family." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their sudden conditional loyalty was genuinely staggering to witness. I looked down silently at the two broken, sobbing women groveling shamelessly at my feet. They were not apologizing for the long, agonizing years of horrific emotional abuse. They were not expressing genuine remorse for attempting to frame me for massive international wire fraud just to save their own comfortable lives. They were simply mourning the permanent loss of their unearned luxury and aggressively demanding that I step in to fund their continued parasitic existence. They truly believed that my success existed solely to be harvested for their convenience, remaining blind to the bitter irony of their sudden dramatic downfall. Julian stood silently beside me, his hands resting casually in his tailored pockets, watching the absolute glorious destruction of my lifelong abusers with a cold, highly satisfied smirk. The heavy silence stretched out endlessly, amplifying the sheer volume of their pathetic, clawing desperation. I slowly reached into the deep inner breast pocket of my tailored crimson coat, feeling the crisp, heavy parchment waiting quietly inside. "You are entirely mistaken about the current legal and financial situation," I stated clearly, my voice slicing through their hysterical, echoing sobbing with absolute freezing precision. I pulled out the officially stamped, deeply embossed, notarized property deed and held it up directly into the bright morning light. "I do not need to negotiate or buy this sprawling estate from the bank to save you from living on the streets, because I already bought it in full exactly 1 week ago." "Oh, thank God." Patricia gasped, the air rushing out of her lungs in a massive wave of profound, utterly misguided relief. The dirty tears streaking her face instantly transformed from markers of absolute terror into shining beacons of delusional joy. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her soiled hands on her ruined designer skirt, her eyes wide with a sudden, sickening burst of manufactured affection. Chloe mirrored her mother perfectly, a wet, eager laugh bursting from her lips, as she tossed aside her ruined silk scarves and stood up on the cold pavement. "I knew you would not abandon us," Patricia cried out, stepping eagerly across the driveway and extending her arms wide to pull me into a deep embrace. "I knew our brilliant, wonderful Zara would save her family. You bought the house to protect us. You saved our beautiful home." I took a swift, deliberate step backward. The sheer force of my freezing glare stopped both women dead in their tracks. The welcoming smiles melted right off their faces, instantly replaced by deep, primal confusion. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I simply looked at them as if they were insignificant insects staining the pavement of my newly acquired property. "Do not dare touch me," I instructed, my tone completely devoid of a single ounce of sympathy. "You are severely misunderstanding the current dynamic. You hear that I purchased this estate, and your toxic parasitic instincts immediately assume I did it for your benefit. You assume that after decades of systematic psychological torture, endless financial manipulation, and your recent attempt to see me locked in a federal penitentiary, I would somehow swoop in to finance your pathetic country club existence." Patricia began to tremble again, her hands dropping limply to her sides. She opened her mouth to argue, to deploy her usual arsenal of maternal guilt, but the absolute finality in my eyes silenced her completely. Chloe wrapped her arms around her own waist, physically, shrinking under the crushing weight of my unyielding judgment. I gestured slowly toward the towering brick facade of the grand mansion. The massive columns and sweeping balconies loomed over us, representing generations of stolen wealth and hidden cruelty. "I did not buy this property to provide you with a luxurious sanctuary," I explained, letting every word land with maximum devastating impact. "I bought it because this specific house is the ultimate monument to your extreme hypocrisy. This estate is the exact site of my greatest childhood trauma. This is the place where you banished me to the smallest room in the attic while Chloe received custom renovations. This is the dining room where Harold mocked my business aspirations while you sat silently sipping expensive wine. This is the driveway where you threw away my college acceptance letters because they did not fit your precise societal narrative." The truth hung heavily in the crisp morning air, suffocating them with its brutal honesty. "For my entire life you worshipped this house." I continued, pacing slowly across the concrete. "You sacrificed basic human decency to maintain its pristine appearance. You treated this physical structure better than you ever treated me. You allowed Harold to commit federal fraud, ruin innocent lives, and destroy local businesses, all just to ensure you could afford the exorbitant property taxes and the extravagant garden parties. You traded your souls for marble floors and imported Italian chandeliers. So I decided it was only fitting that I take the very thing you value most." "You are not stepping foot back inside," I stated clearly, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the wrought iron gates. "You will not sleep in the master suite. You will not host another pathetic gala on this lawn. You have exactly 30 minutes to gather whatever the bank agents legally allowed you to keep, and then you will walk out of those gates forever. You will find a cheap motel or a homeless shelter, or you will sleep on a public park bench. Your housing situation is no longer my concern. I owe you absolutely nothing." Patricia dropped to her knees for the second time that morning, but this time she did not reach for me. She clutched her own chest, gasping for air as a genuine panic attack set in. The undeniable reality of her permanent poverty had finally breached her ironclad denial. Chloe began to wail, a high, piercing sound of pure agony. She looked at the sprawling mansion, realizing she would never again walk down the grand staircase or pose for social media photos in the lavish foyer. They were officially exiles. "You took everything from me!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking violently as she pointed an accusing finger at my face. "You stole our home! You are a monster!" "I am exactly the monster this family created," I replied smoothly, completely unfazed by her childish outburst. "But unlike you, I do not hide my true nature behind stolen diamonds and fake smiles. I earned my absolute power. I built my corporate empire with my own two hands. I bought this estate with clean legal money that I generated myself. I turned away from their sobbing forms, completely dismissing their tragic existence. I looked at Julian, who had been watching the entire exchange with a look of profound respect and dark amusement. The morning sun was climbing higher, illuminating the vast manicured grounds that now legally belonged entirely to me. I walked over to where he stood beside the armored Maybach. "Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet morning air, ensuring the weeping women on the pavement heard every single syllable. "What do you think we should do with all this useless tainted land?" Julian offered a slow, predatory smile and casually gestured toward the street. I followed his gaze, looking past the heavy wrought iron gates. Idling quietly on the affluent suburban street, completely blocking the manicured entrance to the former Washington Empire, sat a massive heavy demolition crew, their massive yellow bulldozers and heavy wrecking balls waiting eagerly for my final command. Julian stepped gracefully to my side, his dark eyes sparkling with a lethal, magnificent amusement. He reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a thick stack of officially stamped municipal documents. The crisp white papers contrasted sharply against his dark suit, catching the morning breeze. He looked down at the groveling women with a chillingly polite expression. "I took the liberty of expediting the local zoning permits earlier this week," Julian announced, his smooth voice projecting effortlessly over the idling diesel engines. "The city council was incredibly receptive to our ambitious urban redevelopment proposal. They unanimously approved the immediate and total leveling of this specific residential parcel. We are entirely cleared to break ground this very morning." Chloe stared up at him, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute uncomprehending horror. "You cannot build commercial property in this neighborhood," she shrieked, her voice frantic and shrill. "This is an elite, historically protected residential district. The Homeowners Association will literally sue you into bankruptcy." "They already tried, and they failed spectacularly," I replied, savoring the bitter taste of her manufactured outrage. "I am not building a commercial retail center, Chloe. I am utilizing my personal philanthropic foundation to construct a state-of-the-art sanctuary and comprehensive educational center. It is specifically designed to house, protect, and empower pregnant teenagers who have been cruelly abandoned by their toxic status-obsessed families. I am taking the crown jewel of the Atlanta elite and transforming it into a permanent refuge for the exact type of vulnerable people you and Mother spent your entire lives viciously mocking." Patricia let out a guttural, suffocating wheeze. The mere concept of vulnerable, marginalized youth occupying her sacred exclusive zip code was a violation worse than bankruptcy itself. I was permanently poisoning the elitist soil she had worshipped. The pristine, superficial legacy of the Washington family was not just being financially liquidated, it was being socially desecrated. I did not wait for them to process the finality of their defeat. I turned my gaze toward the waiting foreman standing beside the lead bulldozer. I raised my right hand, catching his attention, and delivered a sharp, definitive nod. The response was instantaneous and earth-shattering. The heavy diesel engines roared to life, unleashing a deafening mechanical symphony that vibrated violently through the soles of my shoes. The ground trembled as three massive yellow excavators rolled forward, their thick metal tracks chewing aggressively into the meticulously manicured front lawn. The pristine turf, which had cost tens of thousands of dollars to maintain annually, was instantly ripped to shreds beneath the unforgiving treads of the heavy machinery. The lead excavator positioned itself directly in front of the sweeping, aristocratic portico. The operator expertly manipulated the hydraulic controls, raising the massive rusted metal claw high into the air. For one breathless, suspended second, the heavy steel hovered over the majestic entrance of the Washington estate. Then, with a terrifying mechanical screech, the heavy arm swung forward. The iron claw crashed violently through the towering custom-carved mahogany front doors. The explosive sound of splintering wood and shattering stained glass echoed like a bomb blast across the silent, affluent neighborhood. Decades of manufactured prestige were instantly obliterated in a single devastating strike. The heavy machinery ripped the doors from their reinforced hinges, tearing away large jagged chunks of the pristine brick facade in the process. Patricia watched the destruction with wide, unblinking eyes. Her fragile, superficial reality entirely collapsed under the sheer brutal violence of the demolition. She tried to scream, but her lungs completely seized. The blood rapidly drained from her face, leaving her skin a ghastly translucent white. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed backward, fainting dead away onto the muddy, torn-up grass. She lay there completely motionless, her ruined designer dress soaking up the damp earth, utterly defeated by the loss of her physical kingdom. Chloe did not rush to aid her unconscious mother. Instead, she fell to her knees screaming in pure, unadulterated agony. It was a harrowing guttural sound that tore through her throat, echoing the violent tearing of the mansion's walls. The second excavator drove its massive metal bucket straight into the formal dining room, completely annihilating the crystal chandeliers and the imported marble flooring. A massive cloud of thick, suffocating gray dust erupted from the deep wound in the house, billowing outward and washing over the front lawn. The dust coated Chloe's tear-streaked face, settling heavily into her expensive hair and clinging to her ruined silk clothes. She coughed violently, blindly reaching out toward the collapsing structure, as if she could somehow hold the crumbling bricks together with her bare hands. Every single swing of the heavy wrecking ball systematically dismantled her entire identity. The sprawling master suite, the elegant ballroom, the sweeping grand staircase, all of it was being mercilessly crushed into an unrecognizable pile of shattered drywall and twisted metal rebar. Julian stepped slightly in front of me, shielding my silk suit from the rolling cloud of debris. I stood my ground, watching the magnificent devastation with absolute unwavering clarity. There was no sadness, no regret, and absolutely no lingering attachment to the falling structure. The house had always been a gilded cage, a monument to their cruelty, and watching it fall was the final necessary exorcism of my painful past. I was actively clearing the rot to build something genuinely beautiful. The heavy machinery continued their relentless assault, their engines roaring over Chloe's endless, pathetic sobbing. The walls of the estate buckled and groaned, finally caving inward with a massive, thunderous crash that shook the entire street. The sky above us filled with a thick, obscuring haze of pulverized concrete and shattered memories. The formidable Washington Empire had been reduced to a literal pile of worthless rubble in a matter of minutes. The villains who had relentlessly tormented me were left with absolutely nothing, abandoned on the dirty street and completely surrounded by the literal ruins of their shattered ego. I did not linger to watch Patricia and Chloe desperately weep over the pulverization of their fragile reality. The cacophony of shattering glass, groaning timber, and grinding metal provided a fitting soundtrack to their absolute downfall, but I had already witnessed enough of their pathetic despair. The insatiable urge to seek validation from these hollow, superficial people had completely evaporated from my soul, replaced by a profound, unshakable tranquility. I turned my back on the billowing clouds of thick gray dust and the hysterical wailing echoing across the ruined lawn. Reaching out, I firmly linked my arm through Julian's. My brilliant, wildly successful son looked down at me with an expression of profound pride and shared vindication. He had meticulously orchestrated the federal downfall of his corrupt grandfather, protecting our genuine legacy, while systematically dismantling their fraudulent empire. We moved with synchronized, unhurried grace toward the waiting armored Maybach, ignoring the spectacular destruction occurring behind us. The contrast between the two factions was razor-sharp, striking, and undeniably poetic. In the chaotic background, the Washington women were completely reduced to screaming, broken figures, crawling through the mud in ruined designer gowns, desperately mourning a superficial status they had never truly earned. In the crisp foreground, my son and I walked with our heads held high, radiating absolute calm and undisputed victory. We were completely untouched by the airborne debris and entirely unbothered by the toxic devastation unfolding just yards away. Julian opened the heavy door of the luxury vehicle, his gesture respectful and deferential, protecting me from the chaos outside. I slid onto the plush leather seat, savoring the cool climate-controlled air that instantly shielded us from the suffocating dust of the demolition site. He climbed in beside me, pulling the heavy door shut with a solid, definitive thud that perfectly severed our physical connection to the Washington estate. Our private driver smoothly engaged the powerful engine, carefully checking the rearview mirror for my final visual confirmation before proceeding. I gave a subtle, decisive nod, and the heavy vehicle glided effortlessly down the long, curving driveway. We bypassed the towering piles of discarded luxury furniture and the weeping women who had once treated me as an inconvenient outcast. They did not even register our departure, entirely consumed by the violent destruction of their precious material kingdom. The Maybach slipped seamlessly through the massive wrought iron gates, merging onto the pristine suburban street without hesitation. I did not look back, completely severing my emotional ties to the past. There was absolutely nothing left behind us worth salvaging, only ghosts and broken glass. The heavy metal gates slowly swung shut, closing the final chapter on decades of systematic emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and profound psychological torment that had defined my early years. As the driver expertly navigated the winding tree-lined streets of Buckhead, the vehicle's premium sound system automatically engaged. A crisp, professional voice immediately filled the quiet cabin, loudly broadcasting the mid-morning financial news segment. The anchor was energetically detailing the spectacular, unexpected market shifts that had occurred over the past 24 hours. I leaned back against the comfortable leather, closing my eyes as the broadcast specifically mentioned my venture capital firm. The anchor animatedly reported a massive, unprecedented surge in our quarterly profits, directly attributing the astronomical success to a series of highly aggressive, flawlessly executed international startup acquisitions. The market valuation of my independent corporate portfolio had officially doubled overnight. The financial world was loudly celebrating the exact same strategic brilliance that Harold Washington had spent my entire life viciously dismissing as feminine incompetence. Julian tapped his sleek tablet, bringing up the real-time market graphs that perfectly mirrored the radio broadcast. He tilted the glowing screen toward me, his dark eyes shining with genuine admiration. We had not only survived their ruthless attempts to freeze my corporate assets and orchestrate my federal incarceration, but we had thrived exponentially. The immense wealth I had generated was clean, legally secured, and completely impenetrable. I had built a towering financial fortress that Harold and Bradley could never touch, utilizing the exact same analytical genius they had foolishly underestimated. The radio anchor continued detailing our market dominance, his enthusiastic report serving as the ultimate, undeniable validation of my lifelong struggle for independence and respect. We were no longer just surviving. We were actively dictating the future of the global industry on our own entirely uncompromising terms. The armored vehicle smoothly merged onto the busy interstate, accelerating toward the heart of the city. I slowly opened my eyes and looked out through the darkly tinted windows. The magnificent Atlanta skyline rose proudly in the distance, a glittering collection of glass and steel piercing the bright blue morning sky. The sun shone with incredible brilliance, casting a warm golden glow over the bustling metropolis. It was a city I had once viewed as a sprawling cage, controlled by my father's extensive political connections and dirty money. Now it was my absolute, undisputed kingdom. Every towering skyscraper and busy intersection represented infinite possibilities and unparalleled freedom. The suffocating, toxic shadow of the Washington family had been permanently eradicated from my existence, replaced by the limitless horizon of my own magnificent making. I rested my head against the soft leather seat, a gentle, genuine smile finally touching my lips as I savored the flawless victory. The heavy, agonizing weight of childhood trauma, perpetual rejection, and unearned guilt had been entirely lifted from my shoulders forever. I had successfully executed a flawless, perfectly legal revenge against the monsters who had tried to destroy me. More importantly, I had protected my brilliant son and secured our generational wealth. The screaming, broken villains were left wallowing in the literal dust of their shattered egos, while I sat comfortably in the back of a luxury vehicle ascending to the absolute pinnacle of the financial world. I had successfully reclaimed my stolen life permanently, asserted my undeniable power, and finally secured my ultimate lasting and beautiful peace.